When I was 13 years old, I stayed the night at my friend Tommy's farm. I was one of two friends that got to sleep over after his birthday party, and I remember we couldn't wait to go night swimming. Tommy lived on a massive farm where he owned a couple of animals like cows and goats, but the highlight of it was without a doubt the pool that he had. So we waited for everyone to leave, and then quickly got changed, and we were in the pool until like 9:30 at night. When we got out though, the mood of the night quickly took a turn. I was standing on Tommy's back deck, drying off and looking over toward the cornfield that marked the edge of his property, and I could have sworn that I saw a few of the stalks swaying back and forth as if something had just run through them. I focused on the cornfield and tried to see if I could notice anything else, when out of nowhere I heard the eerie sound of an owl hooting behind me. I almost jumped out of my skin with how loud it was, and when I turned around I realized why. I stood on the porch in awe as I stared at this single owl that had been perched right on the post that ran along the back deck. I had never seen one in real life before, and it was like it had me in some sort of trance. I couldn't stop staring at it. That was when Tommy grabbed me by the shoulder and yelled that we needed to get inside quickly. I shook my head and looked around, confused as I heard Tommy talking again. "There's something in the cornfield," he said as we all rushed into the house. We slammed the door shut behind us and locked it just to be safe, and as soon as I got the chance, I asked Tommy what was going on, and that was when he told us that he usually didn't like going night swimming because it was too scary. I asked him why it was scary, and he said that something always watches him from the cornfield. As much as I wanted to think that he was being ridiculous, something about what he said gave me chills. I decided to take a look out of the kitchen window since it faced the cornfield, and at first, I couldn't see anything. But then my eye caught it in almost the same exact area that I'd seen before. I could see some of the corn moving around. I showed Tommy what I was seeing, and the two of us locked onto the section of the cornfield. We must have been staring at it for about 5 minutes with nothing happening. I started to think that I was just seeing things, but then we both heard our friend Derek let out a loud gasp. I looked over toward him and saw that he backed away from the window that he was watching the field through, and quickly ran over it and asked him what he saw. But before he could answer, I saw it too. I took a step away from the window to let Tommy through so that he could see, and we all stood there in terror as we watched what looked like a grown man emerge from the cornfield. He didn't step out too far from his hiding spot, but it was as if he was trying to look for us around the yard as we watched, his head swiveling back and forth. I asked Tommy if he could recognize who it was, but he was too afraid to say anything, so I decided to get his parents and tell them what we were all seeing. Tommy's dad quickly rushed over to the window and was surprised that we were telling the truth. I had never seen him so angry when he realized that the person who was watching was someone that he knew. Tommy's dad rushed outside after telling us to call the police, and he went over to confront the man who turned out to be their neighbor from 2 houses over. We all watched from the window as Tommy's dad yelled at the man until the police arrived. After that, we called my parents as well as Derek's, and we all ended up going to our own homes from the night. I tried talking to Tommy about what happened, and apparently, there wasn't enough evidence to charge his neighbor with anything, but they were able to get a restraining order that required him to stay far away from his house and that cornfield. When I was 14, I was invited over to her birthday sleepover at my friend Harmony's house. This was back in the late 90s when sleepovers were a really big deal, and a lot of planning went into it, because you couldn't rely on cell phones and the internet to keep your guests entertained. There were only 3 of us, myself, Harmony, and our other friend Olive. Harmony had just turned 15, so naturally there was a party with several members of her family in attendance. We all played in the pool, threw horseshoes, and had dessert-making contests with a load of different baked sweet goods for us to combine and enjoy. We watched Back to the Future on VHS as the family started to trickle out, and we set up our sleeping bags on the floor. Ernie shared a room with her older sister, so the 3 of us would be sleeping in the much more spacious living room. That way we could watch movies late into the night. Harmony lived in an old mid-century single-story house from the 1960s, and at the far end of the living room, there was a short drop of about 3 steps into a den. I set up my sleeping bag. Near the stairs, with my toes hanging over the top step, we started watching Black Beauty. It was just the 3 of us in the living room at that point. Harmony was the closest to the TV. Olive was by the couch, and I was still near the steps. For some reason, I kept glancing over my shoulder and peering into the darkness of the room behind me. I felt uneasy, kind of paranoid. But we had to be careful not to disturb anyone who might be in that room, even though I knew it was empty. I asked Harmony if we could turn on the light in there, so I could just relax and plainly see that there was no one there. She declined, not wanting to get up out of her sleeping bag, and I didn't know where the light switches were. Harmony fell asleep first, and when the movie ended, Olive and I just sat in the dark, whispering back and forth because I thought I heard a noise from the den behind me. But the dull tap someone makes when they sit down a coffee mug, I asked Olive if she heard anything, and she always said she didn't, though to be fair, she was deaf in one ear. I didn't want to come across as a baby and move across the room, stepping over both girls in the process, so I made myself stop paying attention and drifted off to sleep. I woke up twice, both times to pull my sleeping bag tighter around my chin because for some reason it seemed to be slipping out from underneath me, and down the stairs. The third time I woke up was because I clearly heard the sound of a book falling off the shelf in the den behind me. Not a small book either. It was a big textbook. I looked over my shoulder. The first light day was starting to peek through the windows, and I didn't see anything other than the book on the floor. When I laid my head back down on the pillow, that's when it happened. My sleeping bag was firmly, almost violently tugged, and I slid across the floor with it. I tumbled fully down the stairs, smacking my chin on each step. It happened very fast, but I remember clearly that my legs never touched the stairs. It was only my upper body that made contact with the carpeted steps because I was physically being pulled down them and my legs were in the air. I freaked out and raised 7 different types of hell. I kicked off my sleeping bag and sprinted up the stairs and ran into the bathroom on the far side of the house where I locked myself in and cried. Harmony and her family assumed that I had a nightmare. But then when I told them that I was pulled down the steps, they tried to reassure me that I had just fallen in my sleep. I knew the truth, though. I had a rug burn on my chin to prove it. Had I been asleep, I would have maybe slid down the stairs very slowly. When they made sure that I wasn't hurt, Harmony's dad retrieved my sleeping bag, and we all had a very early breakfast. I went home still shaken, and for a few days, I had to sleep with my bathroom light on. It wasn't until a few years later when I was getting ready to graduate from high school that Harmony told me that her parents knew there was paranormal activity in that far room, but chose not to tell us. I never told her, but ever so often in my nightmares, I am pulled down those steps again, and in the dream, I always see the same pale face. It's the face of a toothless old woman. She is silently screaming at me with furious eyes as she drags me towards her. I was having a sleepover at my friend Frank's house, which I always loved and hated to do. I loved it because we always had fun during the day. But for some reason, weird things always happened to me at night, and this time was no different. We spent most of the day playing air hockey and running around the backyard before getting tired enough to watch some TV in the upstairs living room. It was around 7:30 by that point, and the sun had gone down, and I was starting to feel uneasy already when, out of nowhere, I started hearing a sort of tapping noise coming from behind me. I looked around to see what it was, but I couldn't see anything. So I asked Frank if he heard the noise too, and he clearly did. I tried to ignore it, thinking that it was one of the pipes or something, but as we watched TV, it was like the noise was getting louder, and eventually the tapping noise transitioned into a scratching. It sounded like someone was inside the wall, and they were trying their hardest to claw their way out. I couldn't pull my attention away from the noise, and it's like it didn't want me to because it just kept getting louder and louder, until eventually, even Frank's parents heard it. His mom came rushing up the stairs to ask us what we were doing, but as soon as she got to the top, it was like the sound miraculously just stopped. She looked at us like we were crazy. When we told her that, it sounded like there was something in the wall, and then his mom just went back downstairs. I hoped that that was the only thing that was going to happen that night, but about an hour after his mom came upstairs, the noise stopped. I heard it again. This time it was while I was laying down to go to bed on the other side of the room, but somehow the noise was once again coming from right behind me, and again it started out as a tapping sound, and before I even got Frank's attention, it had turned back into the loud scratching that we heard before. This time, though, it almost sounded like the scratching was paired with a banging sound, like someone was trying to smash and claw their way through the wall. Both I and Frank started to scream for his parents, but once again, as soon as they got upstairs, the noise mysteriously just stopped. They tried to calm me down, but I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't spend any more time in the house and asked if I could please use the phone to call my parents. As I waited for my mom to pick me up, I felt bad for leaving Dakota. But he used to say that those things only ever happened when I was spending the night. It took about an hour for my mom to get to his house and pick me up, but as soon as I got home, I was able to relax. The next Monday in school, I spoke to Frank and asked if they ever figured out what the sound was. And all he said was that, whatever it was, stopped making any noise almost as soon as I went home that night. I rarely stayed at Frank's after that, but when I did, it was never a dull night, and something weird always seemed to happen that we could never explain.